Hello, I'm Jim Burnett. It is May 1984 and Tim Wooldridge is guest speaker for this show, the 10th in our series on NASA and aeronautics. Wooldridge is chairman of aeronautics at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. In this program, taped at NASA's Lewis Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio, Wooldridge uses a fine display of visuals in describing the various functions of the Air and Space Museum. I believe you will find the presentation enjoyable. Wooldridge is prominent and knowledgeable and articulate in the field of aeronautics.
We're going to talk about the National Air and Space Museum, but let me start out before I show you some slides. Let me give you some numbers, because it would be a natural reaction to say, if you've not been to Washington, well, what's so good about the National Air and Space Museum and who needs it? What's it all about? 75 million people have thought that was pretty good. Last Wednesday, we had our 75 millionth visitor in 8 years. Simple math puts you somewhere up around 10 million. This year, at the rate we're going, we will have over 12 million people in the museum this year. It's incredible. When the museum was built, they anticipated about 3 million a year. They had over 10 the first year. So if we could turn down the lights just a little bit and turn on the slide projector. This is what it used to look like. Many of you who grew up around Washington or visited there way back in the 30s and 40s probably remember this old tin shed. This was the original National Air Museum on Independence Avenue, and that's where most of the artifacts were on display. They did have the Spirit of St. Louis and the Wright Flyer and some of the large aircraft over in the Arts and Industries building, which, by the way, still exists, used for other functions. This dates from pre-World War I and actually has a kind of a NASA-related history to it. Jerry Hunsaker, a very famous aeronautical engineer in his day, did a lot of his work here, as was a lot of the pre-NASA days research done in that building. That's what it was like for years. And this is what the present National Air and Space Museum looked like in 1972. And take my word for it, as Mr. Stofan can attribute to, there is nothing more valuable in Washington than a parking lot. And it was not a simple matter to say, oh, that looks like a good place to put a museum. Let's take it over. No way. So in 1972, after all the bureaucratic wrangling was done, this parking lot began a transformation to the Air and Space Museum. It took 4 years from beginning to end to construct it, dig the hole, build the building, get the artifacts moved in. This is just a shot of it along the way. That's what it looks like now, and it has not changed. The external appearance has not changed at all since the day it opened. It was completed July 1st, 1976, and it has another thing in common with Lewis. It was pointed out to me this morning that your zero-G pit out there was bought in under budget and ahead of schedule. So was that. They turned money back in from the budget to build this the Air and Space Museum, and it was completed well ahead of schedule. I want to show you some of the items that were moved in to the building. They started about 4 months ahead of time. And these artifacts came from all over the country. And what you're looking at right here is the Skylab. And it came from Huntsville. And I haven't checked my Waterways of America book lately, but I understand it somehow found its way over to the Mississippi, down the Mississippi, and came up the inland waterway by barge in 3 pieces. And that's what you see here. This was the largest artifact to move into the museum. It came in 3 sections, as I said. Here is a picture, I think, and we had a little debate over this last week on just what we're really looking at, but the consensus of opinion with the space experts seemed to think that that was part of the Apollo-Soyuz craft that was moved into the West End. This is the Douglas World Cruiser, and I should add that it doesn't have any wings on it. This was one of the first of 4 aircraft that started the round-the-world trip on April 6th to September 28th in 1924. Started from Seattle, and 3 of them finished it. And this was the first airplane we moved into the building. Here's the Spirit of St. Louis being hoisted to the overhead. Let me tell you about some of the people who are involved in doing this. Fantastic. You have professional riggers, of course, and they're union people and a lot of rough, tough, burly types who are very proud of their profession. But it was fantastic to see the artists come out in these people. They would hang the Spirit of St. Louis, and this guy they called the Greek, I remember, would stand out there. He was a real burly fellow, had never done anything like this in his life. He said, I think you better lower the wingtip about 3 degrees, and make it look like it's really flying. The interesting part about it was that it was a tremendous cooperative effort. You had union people, non-union people. You had the curators rolling up their shirt sleeves and getting out there and actually doing manual labor when it began to look like we wouldn't get everything moved in time. You had volunteers, docents. It was a wonderful effort. This is a picture of the Douglas World Cruiser as it was being hoisted to the ceiling where it's on display. One of the interesting things about many of the older airplanes that you see in the museum is that the pilots are still alive. And as the years go by, they get fewer and fewer, obviously, but I was mentioning at lunch that Lee Wade, General Lee Wade, who was the pilot of one of the Douglas World Cruisers, is alive and well. In fact, was in the museum last week. Jimmy Doolittle was in the museum last month. So these old-timers keep coming back, and it's a wonderful experience to be able to sit down and pick their brain. Now, I would like to be able to say that in 4 months of moving things into the museum, nothing happened. I'm about to show you the one thing that happened. We were hoisting the DC-3. They obviously attached the wings before this next picture that I'm about to show you. And they got it about 3 feet off the deck, and all of a sudden there was this horrendous snap, and a fitting broke on one of the steel girders overhead, which was holding a cable, which was holding the airplane. And the fitting started sliding across the cable, released the tension on the wing. The DC-3 fell down and really bent up the wingtip, and it was replaced within 3 days. They found a new wingtip down at Robbins Air Force Base, down south from a C-47, and it was flown up and put in, and business as usual. You talk a lot of guilty-looking people standing around walking away. Gee, it didn't happen on my watch. This is the Jupiter C, I believe, going into position. A very basic decision had to be made before they put a shovel into the ground. Do we build the building around the missiles, or do you make the building and then put the missiles inside later? And that was the decision that was made. And some of these, the big ones that went in there, actually there's 4 inches clearance between the top of the largest missile and the ceiling. So they called it pretty closely, but correct. Opening ceremony. There's Michael Collins on the right side there, of course, a very famous astronaut and at that time director of the National Air and Space Museum. President Ford and the Vice President, and the Chief Justice was there also. And very seldom at any given occasion you would find all 3 of those people present. This fancy-looking gadget should appeal to most of you here because it was designed to cut the ribbon to formally open the museum on July the 1st. But the signal that was going to trigger this fancy little device was coming from the Viking en route to Mars. And it, in truth, worked. They got a signal from Viking, and it cut the ribbon. And unknown to most people there, we had a little green Martian standing around the corner with a little beeper to set that thing off at the right time if it didn't happen. But it did work fine. And by the way, the Viking is now part of the collection. You probably read about it in the paper last week that we have formally accepted custody of the Viking lander now sitting on Mars. So it's part of the National Air and Space Museum. I don't know how many visitors a year we're going to get, but and that's a picture of it cutting the ribbon. It worked. There's President Ford on the right. And this is the main gallery immediately after the opening ceremony when it opened to the public. It's called Milestones of Flight for very obvious reasons. When you just look at it, you will see more famous vehicles sitting in there than any one place you can think of. And I think one of the more interesting things in here, the width of that gallery is 120 feet. And on the left side of your picture there, you can see the original Wright Flyer, and that was the distance of its original flight. But yet not more than 20 feet from the Wright Flyer, there's the Apollo 11, which 66 years later, went 250,000 miles. Of course, obviously, I don't have to talk to you about technology, but the interesting thing is with all this beautiful equipment and examples of our modern technology, yesterday, one of the last things I did before I left was have one of the curators go down, and we have the same weather this week that you did, and count the leaks and add them up. We have a leaky roof in that building, and for 8 years we have been unable to stop it. So there's water coming through on the Wright Flyer and the Spirit of St. Louis, but we're working on it. There is the grand old man. I understand he was here not too long ago, within the last year or two, Paul Garber. He is the historian emeritus. And one of the most humbling experiences of my life was to try to give a speech directly after he gave one. Now, he's been here 60 years, has met and knows personally every famous aviator who ever lived on a first-name basis. And one of the first talks I ever gave at the museum about 7 or 8 years ago when I got there was on naval aviation, and I had to follow Paul. And when you stand in front of a bunch of people and talk about Slim Lindbergh and Orville and Wilbur and so on and so forth, and then you go in there and you're giving your first speech, you know, but he's a great man. He's about 84, 85 now and just soldiering along, and he spends most of his time giving lectures and answering his correspondence, which is considerable. He is the person who sent the telegram to Lindbergh and said, we want your airplane. Wonderful person. The Wright Flyer we have talked about briefly. You can see the Spirit of St. Louis in the upper left. The X-1 up there in the upper right, the first aircraft to break the sound barrier faster than the speed of sound, we just got through repainting that airplane. Chuck Yeager keeps coming back every year. And by the way, he is absolutely the most popular speaker of anybody we get during our lecture series. He packs the house. And he's been complaining for 8 years that airplane is painted the wrong color. And he was right. The day that he flew it to the speed record, to break the speed of sound in 1947, it was all orange. So the airplane has now been properly painted. It's completely orange. The moon rock. People are wonderful. And they also, present company excluded, I'm sure, will walk away with anything that isn't nailed down. And we actually caught somebody, hammer and chisel, trying to take that moon rock out of the thing that it's embedded into. Not that little fella, he didn't do it. But it's great. You can actually walk up there and you can rub the moon rock. I'll tell you some more stories later on here about people. This is the Air Transportation Gallery, pretty recent photograph. As you can tell by the Federal Express airplane sitting there, the Dassault Falcon jet, this was offered to us. And when a multimillionaire calls you on the phone, his name is Fred Smith, and he said, how would you like an airplane? You say, sure, where would you like it? But, and we have been criticized for this because immediately this exhibit opened, which was just 7 or 8 months ago. You can imagine who we got phone calls from. Sure later and so on and so forth. And the only comment we had for him was, you know, you didn't call us first. If you had, we would have put your airplane in there. Interesting story, just off the nose of the Falcon jet, you'll see a bi-winged airplane there sitting on the deck in the background. That's a Douglas M2 mail plane. That airplane was restored. It's a 1926, last of its kind, a mail plane, restored in 1977 by Western Airlines. And it used to be a Western Air Express airplane. And they actually flew it from the West Coast to Washington in 1977, followed by an entourage of aircraft waiting for something to happen, and it did. Over New Mexico, has a Liberty engine in it, by the way. It blew an engine. Pilot had to make an emergency landing, and we said, oh boy, there we are. Where are you going to find a Liberty engine that's flyable? Would you believe in the Santa Fe Museum they had one in a crate that had never been opened? So we immediately got on the phone and made a trade with them right over the phone. We'll give you such and such an engine. Now here's what we want you to do with your Liberty engine. And take it out there, and within a couple of days it was in and flew away. Fantastic. World War I. Gallery recreates the atmosphere, if you will, of a forward air base during the World War I days, and complete with sound and light and so on and so forth. One of the airplanes we have in there is this Fokker D7, and the history on this is kind of interesting. 2 days before the end of World War I, a German count got in this airplane and defected, if you will, across the enemy lines, landed at an American air base, and surrendered. And the U-10 on the side of the airplane, from what we could finally figure out doing our research, was that this was the designation of the cavalry unit that he used to belong to before he joined the German Air Force. Messerschmitt 109G. Interesting thing about this, I was given a tour one day to a gentleman from the FAA right across the street, and he's an American citizen. And he casually said, you know, I've got almost 500 or 600 hours in combat in that airplane. I said, my Lord, where did you do that? And he said, I was flying for the Israelis in 1948. And we were flying the surplus 109s. And I tried to find out what he was doing flying for the Israelis and didn't get very far. But flight testing, the Bell P-59A, the first U.S. jet-powered aircraft. And I won't say the first operational, because it wasn't. It was not much of a success. It was later used as a trainer. The P-80 was the first successful operational jet. The Winnie Mae Many people remember it, of course, for the Wiley Post Round the World flights, but really quite distinguished for the high-altitude research flights that Wiley Post did in these. And just to the right there, you can see his pressure suit, which was the first of its kind and successful. The extra landing gear that you see there was an auxiliary set that when he was doing his high-altitude work, they took off the main gear, put on that detachable landing gear. When he got into the air, he pulled a handle in the cockpit, jettisoned the landing gear to get rid of the drag, went up and did his high-altitude flights and so on, and came back, cut the engine just before landing, and got the prop so it was 3 and 9 o'clock, and landed on a skid. There's a wooden skid, and you can see it right there, metal covered, and he would land with no damage to the airplane. Fokker T-2, first aircraft to cross the United States non-stop, required the pilots to change seats, if you will, 5 different times, 27-hour trip, so you can see why they did. I like this airplane. We've all got our favorite airplanes. This is the Curtiss R3C-2. It was a racing plane of the 20s, mid-20s. Jimmy Doolittle flew it to a world speed record at 245 miles an hour, but it has a couple of interesting features. First of all, the radiator's in the wing. It's corrugated wing, and some of the fuel tanks are actually in the pontoons. The fuel was taken from the pontoons up through pipes and up into the engine. The Lockheed Sirius, they're on the right, flown by the Lindberghs together during their survey flights for Pan Am. The nickname is Ting Misartok, and it's an Eskimo name for one who flies like a big bird. This is one of my favorite galleries, probably because I was the curator of it when I first got there. It's called the Sea Air Gallery, and it's designed to give you the impression of being on the hangar deck of an aircraft carrier. The 76 simply means that every aircraft carrier in the Navy has a side number, if you will, a designation, like 65 is the Enterprise and 62 the Independence. Well, this was commissioned in 1976, so that's the 76. And what you see there is a quarterdeck, and this is what the inside looks like, and it's supposed to approximate the hangar deck on an aircraft carrier. We have 4 aircraft in here. And you can just about see every one of them if you look hard. And the upper right is a Douglas Dauntless dive bomber from World War II. And the lower right is a Wildcat fighter. Lower left is a Douglas A-4 jet. And way up there in the upper left-hand corner is another one of my favorites, an F-4B Boeing. This gallery has been a lot of fun. This is supposed to simulate what they call primary flight control, or PRI-FLY, in an aircraft carrier. And that's the control tower, if you will. And in that in the PRI-FLY installation, you have the air boss, air officer really, and they call him the air boss, and the assistant air boss. And they are responsible for what happens on the flight deck of the carrier and in the traffic pattern. Well, you can see them sitting there, and we try to use mannequins wherever we can to create the atmosphere. And we have caught people walking out of the gallery with the air boss's head under their arms and so on. But that's all right. We took them down to the morgue and glued the head back on with crazy glue so they couldn't take it off. But we really drew the line. We finally took them out of the gallery. We couldn't fight the problem anymore. This simulates the bridge, of course, the command center, if you will, on the carrier. And you can't see him, but just to the left is another mannequin. That's the commanding officer. And he's still there. But let me tell you a little anecdote. The night that this exhibit opened, which was 7 or 8 years ago, we had a very formal, very nice reception in the gallery. The Secretary of the Navy was there and made a nice speech dedicating or commissioning the carrier and so on. This was a selected group of guests, I thought. Well, by the time that the reception was over, this is after working hours, the captain's insignia were gone, his eagles from his collar, his brass belt buckle was gone, and we had real hair in him, by the way, and some patches of hair were gone. I said, okay. We have never put the insignia back on. That's a loser. We figured that out. And we finally solved the brass belt buckle problem. We got about a 5-inch long screw, and we just screwed the belt buckle right into his navel, so now he has no problem at all. And we finally had to take him down. About a year later, he was getting completely bald because people would just tear hair off him, so we gave him an artificial head. But he's still there, surveying his domain out there. This model is fantastic. We get so many of our things there from citizens like yourself who just call and say, gee, I wonder if the Air and Space Museum would be interested in this little aircraft carrier model that I built. And that's what happened about 3 years ago. And a gentleman from Colorado named Stephen Henninger, a young man, said, I just built this aircraft carrier model. I wonder if you'd like to have it. And we said, yeah, sure. Send us a picture. What he did. And Noel Henners went out to Boulder, Colorado on business, and he said, I'll drop by and take a look at this. And my gosh, this fellow was building this 12-foot long model in a trailer, and he had built a wing, so his trailer was like an L. He had built a wing onto the trailer just for his workshop to hold this 12-foot long. He had been doing this for 11 years, and he used to work for the Smithsonian. He would travel all around the world in his job as a scientist for the Smithsonian. He was in Peru, South Africa, Guam, and everywhere he went, he would pack this thing up in pieces and take it with him and continue on. This is built to 1/100th scale, and it's the USS Enterprise exactly the way it looked in 1975. And he built it from scratch with no plans. He managed to talk the Navy into letting him go on the carrier for 2 one-week trips, 2 different times on the Enterprise. And many of the airplanes on there are scratch built, some from kits, but modified quite a bit. And he's just like an old mother hen. Every year he comes back to the East Coast to visit his family for Thanksgiving, and he's calling all the time, has anything fallen over? Is everything all right? Are the lights burned out down the hangar deck? No, and then so he will come and visit, and he'll bring little men and put them on there. Or he'll bring some other little modification to put on. It's just, he loves the model, and I tell you, it's one of the most popular exhibits in the museum, and particularly with the Japanese visitors, who are great model builders anyway. When they come in and take a look at that, they just can't believe that that there's not a kit for that somewhere. This is the General Aviation Gallery, which no longer exists. As of 1 month ago, it was totally ripped out and replaced with one dedicated to the golden age of flight, that period between 1919 and 1939. But I put this slide in there because I have to give this talk tomorrow night in Columbus, and that is the spirit of Columbus hanging right there. Let me show you some before and after shots of some of my favorite airplanes. This is a Corsair, which I'm sure all of you recognize, F4U-1D, and if anybody really cares, there's an autograph from Pappy Boyington in the right-hand wheel well. The day we rolled this thing out in mint condition, he, with some of his old Black Sheep squadron, showed up, paid us a visit, so we had a big ceremony, and he signed down in the wheel well. There's what it looks like now. Unfortunately, it's not downtown anymore. It's back out at the hill on display out there, but it was my favorite airplane because I used to fly it for a while. But, here's the Messerschmitt 262, the first operational jet fighter in the world, flown by the Germans in combat. Little known fact, they built about 1,400 of these airplanes, well over 1,000 airplanes, and yet only about 400 of them ever really got into combat. They had so many engine development problems, which should appeal to some of you, I'm sure. There's what it looks like now. We, last week, exactly a week ago, had 3 ex-Luftwaffe German generals in the museum. Steinhoff, Günter Rall, and Krapinski. And we had a little session just like this on a much smaller scale. We put them up there on the platform. We all fired questions at them. Now, these are all retired generals. I mean, post-war. Steinhoff was the head of the German Air Force, and he retired with 4 stars. And the others were lieutenant generals. And between the 3 of them, sitting there on a platform, 648 kills in World War II. 648 victories. And that bothers some people, to be able to sit in there and think like, well, gee, you know, I wonder how many of those were Americans, and here we are sitting here idolizing and these people, but they got some tough questions from the audience, and they handled all of them very well. They really did. The toughest being, well, when did you first see that you were going to lose a war, and when did you do something about it? And pretty good. This is the N1M, the Northrop Flying Wing, all wood, totally falling apart. And this is about halfway through the restoration right here. And here's what it looks like now. I would like to be able to say this is the last flying wing in the world. It isn't. There was one out on the West Coast at Chino Airport, the N9M, which was Northrop's second development in the flying wing field, and it's being restored now to flyable condition. Now, where do we go from here? I've shown you what is downtown, and I've shown you what's at Silver Hill, and there's one thing they all have in common. All those airplanes are small, except for the DC-3, which is the biggest airplane, and by the way, the heaviest in the museum at 14,000 pounds. We have airplanes down the desert at Davis Mountain near Tucson. The original prototype of the Boeing 707, the Dash 80 as it's called, is down there in mothballs. We have a Martin PBM flying boat from World War II, a Boeing 307 transport in the post-war days. We know we're going to get a space shuttle. We know we're going to get a Concorde. It's been offered to us already. So what do we do with these airplanes? We have no place to put them. If somebody said tomorrow, here's a space shuttle, we just have to say keep it, because we don't have any place to put it. So we have all kinds of verbal support and approval for a facility like this out at Dulles International Airport. All we need is the money. And we hope that it will go into this fiscal '85 budget. There'll be a little study money in it, and the next year there'll be a little bit more. And we're hoping that between 3 and 5 years from now, you will see the first building of this complex of 4 out at Dulles. And this is the way one artist sees the complex looking. We want to be close to a runway so that we can fly these airplanes in. That's the reason for the whole thing. These buildings will measure 250 by 300 feet. They'll be at least 75 feet high to take airplanes like a Boeing 747 or the space shuttle. We'll do it one building at a time. And what our plan is that within 10 years, we will have the 4 buildings, and all you have just seen out at the Garber facility, the Silver Hill facility, will be out at Dulles. We'll move the restoration area, the storage area, the whole works out there. What we really want to do is have the world's second best museum.
What did you mean by the second best?
Well, the first best is the one downtown, National Air and Space Museum. Thank you. I couldn't have pointed that one any better.
Tim Wooldridge has shown us why the National Air and Space Museum is one of the country's top attractions, and he revealed some future plans for the museum. Thank you for watching this edition of NASA and Aeronautics. This is Jim Burnett.